also Paul Lynch, he's a member of the executive of our organization in Toronto, and Paul has been on many brigades, and he can talk a bit. A brigade is when we put together a group of people. It's called the Che Guevara Brigade. I think it was the 26th one last time. And from across Canada, and we go to Cuba and we work. The work is kind of minimal, it's not that hard, but it's to react closely with Cubans and to travel and see different parts of Cuba, like the medical, things that tourists don't do. So those are a very good experience that Paul's had, and a good way to see Cuba. So I don't know how long, maybe I'll talk about 20 minutes, half an hour, and ask questions. I've been to Cuba several times, but our organization started 41 years ago. And I had gone to Cuba on a delegation, and I was very impressed with what I saw. And that's a while back. A lot has happened since then. And also around that time, Cuba was opening up for tourists, and Canadians could go there, very reasonable price as it is now, although then it was cheaper, and could visit and see a lot about Cuba, because Canada has good relations with Cuba. And a number of students from Ryerson had gone and had organized a film festival, because there's very little information about Cuba then as there is now. And the film festival was such a success, they had to show the film twice because people were lined up. So we thought it's a good time to start an organization of solidarity. And there's a group in Vancouver that was one of the first in the world to, right after the revolution, to start up and show their friendship and solidarity with Cuba. So we got their constitution and we used some of it, and we started an organization. They grew very quickly, and we did some things such as bring 2 Cuban musicians to Toronto. They were like folk music, and I think it was the first time after the revolution that musicians came to Toronto. And they packed, the audience at Boise was packed with people who wanted to hear them. When they arrived on the stage, everyone stood up and applauded. And the Cubans very modestly said, well, thank you for the applause, but we haven't sung yet. So we accept that you are applauding for our country. And it was very memorable to me. So we started off showing solidarity with Cuba. I brought some of our newsletter. It's called Amistad, which in Spanish means friendship. I brought the last 3 issues because there are different articles you might want to read, and some little cards if you want to join our group. When we started, there was very little on the radio. You didn't hear Cuban music as you do now. Cuban music has really developed some good musicians that are well known, and very often you'll hear them on the radio. In fact, how many of you have been to Cuba, have visited Cuba?
Almost everyone.
Almost everyone, right?
Yeah.
If you haven't gone, you're planning to go, I hope. So there's lots to impress, even as a tourist. If you can get into the city or the towns, you find that the Cubans are very friendly, they're very warm. When you think of it, I was impressed with Cuba because I was in high school when I first heard in 1959 that the revolution was victorious, and that Cuba was telling the Americans, we don't need you, go away, we don't need your casinos and their, the mafia and their corruption and their big companies that were taking money out of Cuba. We can run our country our way on their own. I'm simplifying it, but I was impressed with that because I was only 17 in high school. And I thought, well, if Cuba can do that, a tiny little country, why can't Canada say to the Americans, we don't need you? Because at that time, more so than now, our radio was mostly American music, our school textbooks have little American flags in them. We're studying in school in Toronto. And the domination of the culture and the economy, I didn't like that. Even our literature in school, we didn't study Canadian authors. It was mainly American or British. And so I really admired that from the beginning. Well, it hasn't been easy for Cuba because just for a whole country to decide that they will run things for the benefit of the people, and socialism, it's they're working toward that. Fidel talked about the socialist character of the revolution, but there was opposition, a little bit from within. Many Cubans left the country. The ones who were making a lot of money and living very well, and a lot of doctors left, so they had to develop their own medical training, and they did it based on looking after the whole patient, not based on how much money you can make. And also there was an attack from the Americans against Cuba, both the Bay of Pigs you may have heard about, where it was actually a military attack on Cuba, which failed in 2 days. The Cubans defeated them. And also it's been an economic with the blockade. Not only an American blockade of Cuba, but the Americans have made it extraterritorial, that any other countries or businesses that deal with Cuba will be, they're fined and so on. Although Canada's always maintained our trade with Cuba, but it's still impacted because there are some American companies, American-owned, operating in Canada that will not deal. For example, I think FedEx is one of them. They won't deliver packages to the Cuban embassy. One of the car leasing companies was fined a huge sum some months back because it leased cars to the Cuban embassy in Ottawa. So the impact is very much going beyond between, it's not an embargo between US and Cuba, it's a blockade that has seriously impacted the economy of Cuba and affected them. Every year at the United Nations, Cuba brings a motion of condemning the blockade, calling for it to be lifted. And this is supported by, I forgot the numbers, 172, I keep forgetting, but all of the UN countries vote in favor of that motion, except 2. One time the US abstained when Obama was president, but the last year with Trump, they again voted against the motion, as Israel did, only those 2 countries. Some smaller countries in the past have voted, but they're very, very tiny countries that did it under pressure. So I'm jumping all over here. I'm not sure what areas you want to know about, but I think there's a poem in the latest issue of Amistad that I actually wrote a while back. But it talks about some of the accomplishments of Cuba that make it different. And I sometimes think of them as, they're almost like fingers on my hands, the medical accomplishments. And many people are kind of aware of that. The very low infant mortality rate, lower than the US, because they really make sure that pregnant women, small babies are given all the necessities and are supported so that there is not a loss of life of newborns and small children. And in medical, they've developed some, this actually also helps their economy, but some treatments for diabetes so that amputations of limbs aren't necessary. Some research in cancer research that have come up with some vaccinations, in particular on lung cancer and brain cancer. And there was dengue is one of the diseases spread by mosquito that Cuba developed a vaccine for and treatments. So it's quite remarkable what they've been able to accomplish in the field of medicine, as well as a school that used to be a military naval base is now the Latin American School of Medicine, where young people from many different, I forget how many different countries, go there free of charge to study medicine for 5 or 6 years, to become doctors and return to their country to treat the people in their community. So there are poor people that come who couldn't afford to study, and they do it on the base. There was some films made of young people returning to their own country to give medical support to people who had never in their life seen a doctor because there were none in their area.
There's maybe there's even people who have gone from the U.S. to study free of charge
Even
in
from
Cuba.
the US have gone, yes.
Yeah.
We have some Sweden about
Yeah.
those who, yeah.
You have,
Yeah,
from
they are
Sri Lanka,
practicing
yes,
here.
yes. So, you know, and as Fidel said at one time, we don't send soldiers, we send doctors. And as they've done when there's crisis of earthquakes and in Haiti and Peru and different
Pakistan.
countries and Pakistan. So that is a very different mindset than a country that is keen on running another country, telling them to get rid of their social programs, or the international banks won't lend them money, or selling them huge electrical projects that they can't afford and they go into debt for. And that is what has happened from the US. In the social area, Cuba's treatment of the elderly, their programs for youth and so on, so the social services, the supports in the community. Education, I think it's very well known, very broadly, it can't be hidden. One of the highest education levels. The very first year after the Cuban Revolution, there was a high rate of illiteracy. Adults not able to read and write because they had never learned. And the first thing that was done was young people were sent across the country to teach people in their own communities and their farms and their villages how to read and write until the whole of Cuba was literate. And this has been expanded and sent to other countries like Venezuela and different countries. A method of teaching reading and writing. But teaching reading, not from the point of view of a textbook that has things that aren't relevant. I know even in Canada when we go to school, we learned how to read with Dick and Jane books and see so-and-so play. They use the special textbooks that were designed to talk about the things that the Cuban people were experiencing, such as now we own the land belongs to us. So they were learning to read things that had a meaning to them. In humanitarian, I mentioned the School of Medicine and help around the world in crisis. But Cuba has also helped in Africa, in Namibia, and South Africa was attacking, and they needed help, and the Cubans went. Many of them died in Africa. When Nelson Mandela was released from prison, the first country I think that he went to was Cuba to thank. There was actually a film made about Fidel and Mandela, and when Mandela went to meet Fidel to thank him for all of the help that he gave to South Africa and to Africa. The cultural, a very rich culture, and I'm not talking about, sometimes, and maybe I'm giving an opinion here, but sometimes we see on our own television such shows of demeaning people and such low kind of humor, whereas in Cuba the culture has been developed to a very high level of everyone. It's not something where you have to pay a huge amount to go to an opera. The costs of going are very reasonable, and people are knowledgeable about the culture. The education in the schools, music, sports, probably some of you know that Cuba has done very well in international sports at the Olympics and the Pan American Games and baseball, which is the very popular sport that they're very good at. The dance, wonderful dancers, both performing dances like ballet or stage performances of the Afro-Cuban dance, but just Cubans themselves. I remember I visited a school, and at that time my husband had a video camera. He videoed little children. They were 6, 7 years old. It happened to be a day which was called Teacher's Day, where the kids didn't wear the uniforms. They just wore their own street clothes, and they had cake, and they were celebrating the teachers, and they were dancing. And even little children, they really could put the moves on. They know how to dance. The film development at the time of the revolution, we did a film festival way back at Harbourfront, and one of the film directors came and he told us that it was very easy to do films in Cuba because so much was happening. You just had to turn the camera on the street. But before that, the films were mostly American films that were dubbed in Spanish or Spanish subtitles. And they hadn't developed their own cultural film industry, and that developed very quickly. And there are many Cuban films that have won prizes internationally and have really developed quite a good film industry. On the environment, Cuba has one of the smallest carbon footprints. Maybe one could say it's because they don't have the large consumer goods and so on. But on the other hand, Cuba is also very aware of the environment and protecting its environment and its many species of wildlife and insects, fish, birds, animals. They're very conscious of that. And I remember when from my point of view, when I heard that some years ago in the States, they came up with the idea of using corn as fuel for automobiles. What did they call it? I forgot what it's called. Ethanol. And it sounded like a good idea. So you're not going to be taking oil out of the ground. You're going to use corn, and it's renewable, and run our cars, and it's clean. Sounds good, but Fidel spoke against it. And he said, the price of corn is going to go up, and poor countries, poor people are going to be starving. They won't be able to get corn to eat. And to use food for fuel, you're just supporting the consumerism rather than finding solutions. And I remember thinking about that it really isn't, may sound good for the environment, but it's really not good for taking away the resources that are needed and turning it into fuel for American cars and North American and others. But on the environment, Cuba's been very protective, and it does not have the wastage of everything is used or reused or fixed and refurbished, partly because of the blockade, but also it's not a wasteful country producing goods that last a short while and they're thrown away. I wanted to mention a little bit about the blockade too, that has impacted on a lot of things. In some ways it's, I was going to say it's helped Cuba, but it's not a good thing. But Cuba has turned every time it's faced with a challenge, it turns it into a positive and resolves the problem. So after the Soviet Union fell and the Cuban economy did a tailspin, it was a very, very difficult time. The Americans thought, well, this is it, they'll just go under. They didn't, because they were very resourceful. They set up well, they called it the highway police with yellow on the highway, stopping cars that had room in the car for passengers, sort of a hitchhiking method, because there was very little fuel for buses and transport. So in that way, people could get where they had to go without, otherwise they couldn't. But that way, using the vehicles, the farmers could grow extra food and sell it in the markets. The growing food in their backyards, doing everything they could to survive in that very difficult time and turning the economy into producing more of medicines and developing the tourist industry. So they managed to overcome that, and now they are working on a new constitution. You may have heard about it. The draft has gone through the National Assembly. But when they do it, the constitution is a pretty important thing. It really outlines the rights and the direction of the country. And their constitution that they currently have was actually put to a referendum back, I think it was the year in the late 60s.
1976.
76. Okay. And they're now looking at updating the constitution to bring it into more modern, but not giving up any of their principles for a socialist economy and a system that works for the benefit of the people of Cuba, not to be undermined. And that is a very important principle of it. And when I think of that, Cuba's democracy, I haven't talked much about that, but most Canadians are not aware that Cuba has elections. And they're not elections like we have, where people spend a lot of money buying signs, TV ads, and who knows what influence. Their elections are simply the nominated people. They may be from the Communist Party or they may not be. There's only one party, but it doesn't matter. They can be an individual. And they put their name up, they get nominated in their community, and their names are posted in the community, their picture and who they are, and that's all. There's no advertising, promoting, running around, spending money on trying to influence people's thinking. And when the election day comes, the voter turnout is very, very high, in the 90%, not 40, as sometimes happens here. And the children are guarding the ballot boxes, school children, and they count the votes. It's we don't hear about that here. So, and their elections are, I can't give you the numbers, I'm not statistical, but at the municipal level, there are a huge number of people elected. And I'm thinking of that when we just see, whereas in Toronto, the premier has decided to change the number from 47 to cut it down to 25, just arbitrarily and democratically. So that their municipal level, there are a lot more people at the municipal level. They're in a small community and they can listen to their constituents' needs and complaints and take it to another level, which is quite different from, and I think that's much more democratic, much more powerful than someone who gets elected because they spend the most money, regardless of what they stand for. Or they get elected as premier because they don't put forward any program and just some sound bites or criticism of someone else. So anyway, those are a few things. I don't know if my friends want to add anything. There's a lot to cover. Cuba is a very interesting, has a long history. Actually, Havana is 500 years old next year. And one of the things, I think it may be an article in our newsletter, is Cuba is already planning its environmental strategies for the next 100 years in face of huge environmental issues, especially for a small island where hurricanes are becoming more intense and more often. Anyway, there's a little bit. Anybody want to add?
On the elections, I would just add that what Elizabeth was mentioning about elections at the local level, in terms of accountability of those who are elected, they have to face their people every week. So most Saturday mornings, if you're the elected rep, you gotta go back, and if people have questions about what you're doing, you can't just run off and hide, be on vacation. And so the accountability system is very rigid, and we need more of that here.
And although I'm not aware that it's happened, but legally, if the people who represent you are not doing their job, you can by a majority vote them out of office before the next set of elections. One thing now with, this is from a long time ago, because I did live in Cuba, but a long time ago. And so when they had constitutional discussions and things in the past, so I don't know if it's happening now, but I know where I was working, we had discussions, ongoing discussions. Every workplace in the country had the workers there, had meetings and ongoing discussions and input into the documents that later became law. So that kind of thing is part of the history in Cuba. In terms of
And politicians aren't paid. You're elected by the people, but you're doing it for the good of the community, not because of the size of the paycheck. As well as the accountability that goes along with it, you get much more honest representation than you get out of a system like ours. And it's something to admire in many ways.
Any questions?
Can I ask one? Those days, the Western media always tell around the communist country there is an iron wall, nothing can go in or come out from the country. No? Now Cuba is open to the other countries. So the free flow of capital, is this damaging the structure of the communist system in Cuba like China or some other countries?
One, there's not a free flow of capital through Cuba, per se, because of effects of the embargo and the restrictions. And I'm sure a lot of you have said you've been to Cuba before. I'm sure you didn't take US dollars.
No, I just read the Western media, yeah.
I think it's a question that a lot of people on the left are concerned about too, that if Cuba would go the way of the Soviet Union. I kind of thought of that too, but I think I have faith in the Cuban government. And when Fidel became ill, and then his brother became the elected leader, it's not a dictatorship, it's not one person. There's the whole government, and with the backing of the people, have these positions. So it's not something that can just change overnight. And I think that's a protection, and also they're very clear. I was reading a speech that Raul made at the July 26th, the anniversary of the Moncada attack, and he's talking about the Constitution. And I was talking too about the relations with the U.S. diplomatic, and he said Cuba reiterates that the will to dialogue with respect and work toward improved relations on the basis of equality. Nevertheless, Cuba will never renounce the ideas it has defended for over a century. And another quote, it is no coincidence, he said, that in the draft of our Constitution, it is reaffirmed that the defense of our socialist homeland is the greatest honor and duty of all Cubans. So I think they really are. But at the same time, Cuba is in a very difficult situation. It is a small country. It does not have big resources like Canada has a lot of natural resources. It has to depend on the import of oil. A lot of oil has come from Venezuela, but we know that Venezuela is under attack from the US. It's very threatening, and creating a lot of support for the opposition. And Cuba is dependent on a lot of other Latin American countries. And these countries are under great attack from the US too. In the special period, some of the things I don't think Cuba wanted
Tell
to
people what
do-
the special period is, Liz. They
The
don't
special
necessarily
period was
know.
1990 and onwards when the Soviet Union fell, and the trade and the support that they got disappeared. They had to redevelop and rebuild the economy. And one of the things they did was joint ventures, and that's where, with capitalists, to build a hotel. But Cuba always maintains 51%, so that the conditions that the investors work under are that the Cuba is in charge, and the investors cannot, run the
Exploit.
show. They're
Exploit the
supporting,
country.
it's a joint thing, because they needed to build a lot more hotels. The tourism has gone up. I think when we started, we were pretty impressed. There were 50,000 Canadians going to Cuba, and now it's over 1 million every year. So a lot of hotels, and the hotels have to run. And Canadians go there and they're not just gonna eat rice. Well, even rice, it has to be imported sometimes. So they also have to import some of the food. But more and more they're trying to depend on local rather than imported. It is a difficult problem to build, and the Cuban people want to improve. They need housing, they need more buses. They do have more buses from China. That's improved. But if you were a Cuban, and in the last 20, 30, 40 years, you want to see improvements in your housing, in your buses, in your transport, in your goods. There have been improvements. Cubans have color televisions, they have cell phones, they want internet, they have hotspots now. It's not all enough, but they're spreading and using everything that they have. So I do feel confident that, I'm an optimist anyway, but I do feel confident that the Cuban government will not give in. They fought this long, they're not going to give up. They're not going to buy out. And their government is collective, it's not individuals, pushing one in line, like Doug Ford.
But I think all these things and the situation in the world has impacted Cuban people on a day-to-day basis. And I mean, to be honest, in terms of when I first went to Cuba, it was 1975, and I lived there for 5 years. And there are issues and there are problems around levels of, there was absolute equality, and there are changes in that, and that is part of the whole situation in the world that they have to confront. It's not an easy thing, like you're saying. So there have been